I've found over the years that one of the more challenging concepts to wrap your mind around if you're new at this whole virtualization thing is really understanding the differences between the hypervisor and the tools you use to manage that hypervisor. The confusion is understandable when you look at kind of the marketing that VMware has around this vSphere product. Well, you kind of think about ESXi as really almost everything, right? ESXi is what drives your virtual machines, and so it's the thing that's doing most of the work. There is also some confusion because it is entirely possible for you to manage your ESXi instances directly. So from a vSphere client, you can go and connect up to an ESXi instance and perform some basic management of that host and the virtual machines on top. But at some point, you're going to need more than what just can be done on an ESXi system alone. And when that happens, it comes time to install and purchase your vCenter server. A lot of the confusion I have kind of just centers around the fact that people see vCenter as an extra cost, that it absolutely is. You have to kind of go pay for your vCenter server licensing for you to be able to use it. And as a function, sometimes people get a little confused about when it's important to incorporate vCenter server. Well, the metaphor here is very similar to how things work in the Windows world. If you have a couple of Windows devices or Windows machines, uh, running them in a work group probably works just fine. If you're just dealing with one or two machines, you can deal with the individual user account databases on those machines. You can deal with the individual management of those computers. But as the number of Windows boxes that you have to manage begins to go up, well, it becomes important to spend a little bit of money getting yourself some domain controllers and getting yourselves a fully functional Active Directory. The same holds true here in vSphere. Right? I can have a couple of ESXi hosts here. And as I said, you can manage those ESXi hosts individually, ESXi hosts individually from your management workstation here with the vSphere client. But after a certain amount of time and after a certain number of hosts, you're going to find that managing those hosts becomes a bit unwieldy. And it is for that reason that we end up installing a separate vCenter server infrastructure to be able to manage them as a group. Their user account databases, the roles and permissions, the configurations, the profiles, and all of this stuff. So I kind of start with this little metaphor here because in order for you to be able to do a lot of the more advanced things that you commonly associate with vSphere, doing high availability, doing DRS, doing all the fun stuff that we have associated with VMware in the past, you have to have vCenter server. And so in this nugget, we're going to spend some time actually going through the installation of vCenter server. We'll spend a minute talking about the additions here, so which additions are available, and also some of the requirements that are associated with getting vCenter server just up and running. Got to have some memory, got to have a number of CPUs if you're going to meet VMware's minimum requirements. You also are going to want to at least pay some attention towards the high availability requirements for vCenter server. Now, important to recognize here is that your hosts, your ESXi hosts, are going to continue to function. They're going to continue to operate and run their virtual machines should your vCenter server infrastructure just fall to pieces. But you're not going to be able to enact any changes on them. You're not going to be able to do much with them until you get vCenter server up and running. And so there's a strategic a design piece that you have to kind of think about here as we start talking about these HA requirements. Is the level of pain that you have greater than the amount of effort and cost it takes to install, design, put together this entire HA infrastructure? Something just to think about: how many minutes can you afford for this to be done? Your classic decision-making process anytime you think about implementing HA. Now here in the interaction portion, and we'll get to that HA piece here in just a minute, here towards the end of this nugget. Now in the interaction portion, I want to spend some time actually installing vCenter server. We'll go through a quick licensing activity. And with the vCenter server installed, we're then going to manage vCenter server from the two different clients that now exist here in this version. Now here is where there is just a bit of confusion, or can be a bit of confusion. With this version, VMware actually releases two different clients that can manage vCenter server. There is the classic vSphere client. You can almost think of it as kind of the .NET client, or the native client, and also the vSphere web client. Now the confusion exists because VMware with this release is making a very determined decision to move away from this vSphere client and towards the vSphere web client. So although, at least at this point, there's kind of rough feature parity between the two, you should absolutely expect from this version and forward, all of the updates, all of the improvements are going to happen to that vSphere web client. Now I say feature parity, but that's actually a bit of a misnomer because there are also some components that haven't actually yet made the jump from the old .NET client to the vSphere web client. A couple of the pieces that we'll talk about here in this series they just don't exist in the vSphere web client. And so we're going to have to actually have that traditional client around in order to support those additional pieces. We'll talk more about those later. But just recognize that at least for this version, there's going to be a bit of a hybrid environment that's required, although most of your activities are going to happen here. And in fact, most of the work that we'll be doing happens there in that web client. One of the things that we have to at least be aware of is the fact that the traditional client, the .NET client, has a variety of plugins that you can incorporate. Many of your third parties, so if you've got different solutions out there in the VMware ecosystem, the vSphere ecosystem, they've probably written their integration into vSphere as part of a traditional client plugin. And so one of the other reasons that you may have to have a hybrid environment is just simply because if you have an environment that's composed of any other software than what VMware provides, it's likely that that may happen as a function of a plugin. So just be aware of that the plugins exist. I'll show you where they're at. We'll take a look at what the clients are, and we'll do, again, most of our management here inside of the web client from this moment on. Now, the installation of vCenter Server is, in fact, 4 separate installations. We've got to install an inventory service. We've got to install an SSO server. We've got to install a web client server. And then we can get to the point where we install our vCenter server itself. One of the reasons, or the main reason for the separation of these 4 different installations is so that you can go about installing the different pieces onto different servers. Now, in a very small environment, if you're demoing this, you're following along at home, just stick it all in one machine. As your environment begins to scale, however, and you end up with lots, hundreds, thousands of hosts, it will begin to become important for you to separate out these different components, and that's why they're separated around. One of those components is the SSO server. SSO server, you think of it just as your connection point between your VMware environment and whatever your authentication environment is, Active Directory, LDAP, whatever you intend to use. And in this nugget, we'll talk about how you can go about configuring an SSO identity source as well, because you're going to need to, so that you can authenticate your Active Directory users into your VMware environment. But before we can get around to really doing any of this stuff, we need to spend a minute talking about just some of the additions and requirements that have been levied on your vSphere environment here at this point. And again, I don't want to spend a lot of time here because, again, this stuff will change, right? We're in vSphere 5.5 right now. There will be future editions, whether they're version 6 or what. And when those editions come out, well, we'll see these requirements change. I'll point you to VMware's website so that you can keep abreast of them when it comes time for taking exams. But just kind of be aware that these requirements and what the additions are exist and will change over time. Now, when you're going through your design activity, right, when you're trying to figure out exactly what you want to put into place, one of the first things you have to figure out is, well, which version of vSphere do you actually want to buy? What you might not be aware of is that there are, in fact, 5 different editions of vSphere currently on the market. There is the standard version or edition. There is the Enterprise edition. There is the Enterprise Plus edition. And then way down here at the bottom, you'll see there is an Essentials kit, an Essentials and an Essentials Plus kit. Now, the top 3 and the bottom 2 are kind of 2 different rough categories of these different editions. I'll start with the Essentials kits because they're sort of the entry level, I just want to buy a little VMware and see how it goes plan for people that are just working their way into virtualization. Now, the Essentials kit comes in 2 editions. The first is just the regular one, and then the other one is the Plus kit. The regular one gives you the ability to do just the hypervisor, right? Just to run some virtual machines. If you want to do any of the fun stuff, Any of the advanced things, any of the highly available things like vMotion, like HA, like data protection, vSphere replication, or the endpoint solution, well, then you got to buy the Essentials Plus kit. Both of these kind of come with a bit of a caution because when you buy these kits, you're limited to 3 servers with up to 2 processors each. So you're kind of putting a pretty hard line around what your environment will be. And if you end up needing to scale, well, you're going to end up upgrading into the regular editions. So these exist. These are great for, it says here, branch offices, retail and branch offices, or if you just want to kind of get started with virtualization. But they can also kind of come with some very important oopses if you end up needing to expand beyond that point. When you move into the more regular editions of vSphere, things change just a little bit because we're not talking about servers anymore, 2 processor servers. We're in fact licensing things by the CPU. So when you go about buying your licenses, you're going to have to buy licenses for the number of CPUs that you intend to bring to bear across all the hosts that will be part of your vSphere environment. Okay, so if I've got 2 hosts each with 4 CPUs, well, then I got to buy 8 separate license entitlements or CPU license entitlements, indifferent of which edition we end up purchasing. Okay, so count up your physical CPUs and see where this leads you as it comes time to go about figuring out which edition or how many licenses that you need. You also need to make a decision about which edition is important as well. And here's where things can also get a little sketchy. The standard edition, kind of similar to the Essentials kit, the main Essentials kit, provides just kind of the basic functionality. Now, the basic functionality here in the production version, the main version, is quite a bit more than what you got with the basic Essentials kit down below. You do get vMotion in the standard edition. You do get HA. You do get fault tolerance. You do get replication. What you don't get are these items down here, like reliable memory. The big one here is DRS. You're not going to be able to load balance your clusters when you end up creating them. So if you don't intend on needing some of these functions, well, you might consider yourselves just sticking with the standard mode. The enterprise mode, as you can see here, adds these 4 items, and one down here, the storage APIs for array integration and multipathing. Okay, this item right here, the multipathing and the VAAI stuff, important, and also DRS, very important. Those are kind of the 2 big reasons why you'd make the jump. In our series here, we're going to be focusing on the features that exist in the Enterprise Plus version because I want to show you all the things that you can, or almost all of the things that you can work with if you spend all that money. So we'll be talking about App HA, we'll be talking about storage DRS, we'll be talking about storage I/O control, we'll be talking about distributed switches and host profiles. If you've got the ability to spend that money on the higher editions, some of these additional functionalities can actually be really useful for you, particularly as you scale that environment. Now, what's important to recognize also is that when you buy your vSphere licenses, when you buy your per CPU licenses for ESX, that's going to give you or license you for the ability to run ESX. You will also need to separately license your vCenter server here. Now, again, things getting complicated. vCenter Server comes in 2 different editions as well, vCenter Server Foundation and vCenter Server Standard. Big rule of thumb here is that any of the foundation versions are intended to run 3 hosts, a maximum of 3 hosts. So a lot of ways in which you can kind of accidentally limit yourself here. vCenter Server Standard has no limits. The standard editions over here, the regular editions over here have no limits as well, just based on CPU. So again, I'm showing you this because during your design activities, well, you don't want to end up kind of accidentally limiting yourself and not being able to expand out your vSphere environment like you thought you were going to be able to. Just a couple of quick notes here on the hardware requirements and also the software requirements, also port requirements too for installing vCenter Server. Most of these are pretty basic stuff. a pair of processors, speed of 2 gigs. Going to have x64, so plan on installing an x64 version of your favorite operating system on x64 processors. The one that kind of struck me as just very curious was the amount of RAM that's required. Now, this is for a simple install deployment, but 12 gigs of RAM necessary if you plan on putting all the components onto a single machine. And in fact, higher memory requirements if your SQL or Oracle database that you're plugging this into runs in the same machine as vCenter server. So pretty significant RAM requirements. Don't ignore these, because most of these minimum requirements are pretty self-explanatory or pretty standard, but that was something that just kind of hopped out at me as more than I would have expected. Various other requirements here too. I'm going to point you to the documentation center for the version of vSphere that you're interested in, because these will change over time with each new version. Also here under the software requirements, just a couple of things of note. The first of which is that you're going to have the .NET 3.5 SP1 framework installed on your machine. I've already done this to the machine that we're looking at here. Also, the vCenter Server 5.5 removes support for Windows Server 2003 and Windows Server 2008 SP1. So no more Server 2003, no more Server 2008 SP1 as the server that you can install vCenter Server onto. Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012 both supported here at this time. For a very quick moment, I just want to show you that there are a number of required ports. If you're the type of environment that has firewalls turned on inside your data center, I would be aware of what these ports are. Okay, common test questions. Also, just really important so that you have the necessary firewall ports. And there are a variety of them that are required. Just be aware of what the interconnections are if you plan on incorporating firewalls inside your data center. So these are, again, just a couple of things I want to make you aware of as it relates to the minimum requirements, also the additions of vCenter. Let's go about actually getting vCenter Server installed. We are here on our computer, vc.company.pri. This is a machine with a static address of 1.250. Completely updated this machine, got all the Windows updates on it. As you will find, we also have installed onto it SQL Server. So I'm kind of consolidating everything down into a single computer here. In your environment, you may end up fracturing this into up to 5 really different machines as we go through this installation. Now, before we actually go about installing vCenter Server, one of the things that we have to do is actually get a database up and operational. Now, I've got my SQL Server Management Studio here, and the process to get this database up and running can be relatively easy, or it can be somewhat more difficult depending on what your security requirements are in your environment. If you're the type of environment where you are both a SQL admin and a virtual admin, actually getting the database installed is as simple as just literally creating the database. Right-click New Database here. I create the database name of VCDB, and I'm pretty much done at this point. If you are, however, an environment that does not have, where you are not a SQL admin and also a domain admin or a virtual admin, things can get a little bit more challenging because you need to have DB owner rights over, obviously, the database that you've created, as well as the system database, the MSDB database here. Now, this DB owner rights are necessary just during the installation of vCenter Server. Once you're done with the installation, then you can remove those rights to this database, but it's needed so that you can get all the schema stuff actually installed. In the most challenging of situations, you've got your SQL Server team over there that does not want to give you access to anything at all. And when that team doesn't want to give you access, they want to control everything, they're probably going to be asking you for some kind of database script that will allow them to create the schema on your behalf. And you can think about it, right? You think these really large environments where they're not a virtual admin and you're not a SQL admin, but the two of you need to be able to talk to each other. Well, how do you actually do that when you don't want to give them rights and they don't want to give you rights? Well, thankfully, VMware has actually thought of this. And in fact, if this describes you, if you go to the ISO file where your vCenter server exists, so this is the vCenter server ISO file, Down here on the D drive for me, I want to go to vCenter server and then the DB schema location here. And then built into here are a couple of scripts that you can share with your SQL database admin, the database and schema creation scripts for either SQL or for Oracle, that they can just simply do a little bit of modifications on and then execute these scripts in the database to create all the necessary schema bits. I'm not going to go through all these here, but just be aware that it's creating all the structure, the metadata that's associated with the database you need to create for vCenter server to run. Hopefully this does not describe you, but if it does, this is much easier than you having to translate what all these things will be, or heaven forbid, giving your SQL admins access to the server that you'll run your virtual environment on. We don't want to give them access. Once you've got that database installed, okay, if you recall, we installed that database, we called it vCDB. The next thing we have to do is actually to create a 64-bit ODBC connection using a system DSN. Now here on this machine, I've got a little link here for my ODBC data sources. Very important, a 64-bit ODBC connection and also a system DSN. If you get both of these correct, well, then actually getting the SQL Server native client configured is relatively easy. Let's just call this vCDB, and the server that we're going to is vc.company, if I can spell today.pri. Choose next. And then with integrated Windows authentication in our case, or you can set up SQL Server auth if you want. Make sure you've got the correct permissions on that user. If you do, highly recommend just using integrated Windows authentication here. Change the default database to the database we just created, vCDB. Choose next, choose finish here, and then test the data source. And if everything works, we're done. So create the database, then go through creating the ODBC connection. Doing that will allow us to begin installing vCenter server. So let me come here and let me run the auto run here and show you the VMware vCenter installer. Two different pieces to there, two different approaches you can use with this installer. The first is the simple install, which is really kind of intended for, you know what, Greg, I just want to kind of get this thing up and running so I can tool around with it. For anything that would approach production, for anything that you intend on having out in the real world, you probably are going to want to do a custom install. Now, the reason I say this is because this custom install gives you a bit more granularity as it relates to installing the individual components. I told you there are 4 different components and that each of these components is a prerequisite for the one that comes after it. We have to start by installing vCenter single sign-on. Okay, vCenter single sign-on being that integration between your VMware world and your Active Directory or LDAP world. We then need to install the vSphere web client, a perhaps inappropriately named tool that facilitates the functionality of the web client. So you can kind of think of this as all the web server pieces for the web client, more so than the web client itself. With those 2 pieces in place, we then need to install the inventory service. Now, we install the inventory service later because it is the job of the inventory service to interface with our vCenter server here and to gather kind of like a subset of the content that exists in vCenter server so that it can then relay that information off to the web server here, which then itself relays that information down to your individual desktop. I'm using a lot of words here to say that the inventory service is there to kind of take some of the load off the vCenter server. You think about a very large environment. If I have, 100 different VMware admins, having all of them attaching to my vCenter server directly might end up causing some problems. And in fact, in previous versions of vSphere, as the size of the environment went up, sometimes the client actually slowed down. And part of that is just the sheer enumeration of all the stuff that exists in that environment. Well, it is the job of that vCenter inventory service to kind of take the load off. If I install it onto a different server, it can manage the load without having to tax the vCenter server with all these extra requests that are coming from your administrators. With all of these in place, with these first 3 components in place, then we can go about installing the last piece here, which is our vCenter server itself. Now, as I've kind of alluded to, you can put all these onto a single machine or you can split them up. In our environment, we're going to put them all onto the same computer because we have a really small environment. I got 3 ESXi hosts, and I just want to keep things very simple here at this point. So let's actually go about installing all 4 of these pieces. And I'm going to run through the installs. I'll pause things a couple of times so that you don't have to watch the progress bars go across the screen. But this will give you a look at what these installation routines look like so that you're prepared for them when it comes time to do it yourself. First up here is vCenter single sign-on, the SSO piece. Kind of an interesting side note. VMware has introduced this SSO piece, and it has caused no end of trouble for some of the early adopters of version 5.5. Previous versions of vSphere would just integrate directly in with your Active Directory, and I think in this version, VMware wanted to kind of expand the extensibility of your authentication ability. So with this version, you can connect up to multiple AD authentication sources, identity sources. You can connect up to open LDAP identity sources if you want. And perhaps this was not entirely well baked when it was first introduced. I would highly recommend that before you get to this point, make sure that you have at least version, the vCenter Server version 5.5.0b, because that's the version that includes a number of bug fixes that make SSO very actually palatable. Prior to this, there's all kinds of hackery that was necessary in order to get SSO just simply to work. One of the new pieces actually that came about with SSO and 550B is the incorporation of this little checkbox here, add company.pri as the native Active Directory identity source. I think there was a bug that it didn't actually do this in previous versions, or maybe this wasn't there in previous versions. Again, 550B, very important. Let's go about installing it. We have completed our prerequisites check here, and this is my primary Windows domain, company.pri. So I do want to add this as an SSO identity source as part of the installation. Later on, I can add other identity sources if I want. Again, they can be Active Directory, you can be Open LDAP. There are other alternatives out there. But for now, let's just connect this up to my primary domain here, which is company.pri. I'm going to choose Next, and we will be installing this as SSO for my first vCenter server. As we start getting into HA topics, we may want to add additional SSO servers. So for other servers in an existing site or for servers in a new site. I'm not going to talk about that today, but we are going to install it to our first vCenter server. Another very important thing you should be aware of is the creation, at least in the vCenter SSO space, of an account called administrator@vsphere.local. The administrator@vsphere.local account, you can kind of think of it as your master prime admin for everything that is vSphere from this point on. You're going to have to enter in a password here. It does have to be a strong password. And that password you'll use later on for, I don't know, for adding other identity sources. As your emergency, whoops, I don't have access to my environment account. So make sure you get a good password in here and write it down and just put it away, because you will be needing it, or you may be needing it at some point in the future. Administrator@vsphere.local. Write that down. Choose Next, and obviously make sure that you have the, I always forget that password complexity requirement here. Let's see if that fits it. Aha, there we go. And then what do we want to make our site name here? We'll call this the Denver site because I happen to be in Denver today. Choose Next. I'm going to choose my HTTPS port of 7444. Throughout all these installations, there are going to be a variety of ports that I'm just going to keep with the default ports. Choose Next again, and the Install button to go about installing vCenter Single Sign-On. Let me pause things for a minute. When we come back, we'll move on to the next step. And we're back. Installation here takes, I don't know, 5 minutes or so. Very simple installation, maybe about 5-10 minutes. The next one here is the web client. So following along with our 4 steps here, the SSO to web client to inventory service, the next piece here is the vSphere web client. Go ahead and complete the install here. We're going to install it here in English. Now, one of the things that is important to recognize, I've told you that the web client is really kind of the web server components here. And if you're a Windows shop, you may be familiar with the idea that IIS is your kind of your Windows server. Well, VMware prefers to use solutions that, I don't know, sometimes I think they prefer to use any solution that isn't a Microsoft solution. So the recommendation here with installing these components onto your VMware components onto your Windows server is don't actually install IIS onto that server. Because when you're installing the web client, you're installing other components. I believe the one of the servers is a Tomcat server in this case, instead of what you would think of as IIS. So let's go through here, choose next. I accept the terms of the license agreement. We're going to install that here into this location. I'm going to use these alternative ports for HTTP and HTTPS. Here is that SSO administrator username, administrator at vsphere.local. So if you hopefully you remember to write it down, and if I can remember what it is, there is also our lookup service URL. For the most part, don't really worry about what this lookup service URL is here for this point. We've got another URL we'll worry about when it comes time to manage our environment. So this installs the web client here. This connects it up and gives you all the necessary authentication as part of the SSO installation. You should also be aware, particularly if this is a high security environment, what the SHA-1 fingerprint of the SSO lookup service leaf certificate is going to be. This will be, at this point, a self-signed certificate. So you have the ability to go back and go check out what that is. I'm not going to bore you with the details at this point. So let's go ahead and accept this because, again, at this point, we're merely working with self-signed certificates. A little later on, we can go through and use fully trusted certificates, replace those existing self-signed certificates with ones that are trusted in our environment for production use. Once we've got that, here's all the necessary certificate information we need to complete the secure connection. Let's install that certificate and then install the web client. So let me, again, pause everything one more time. And when we come back, we'll talk about the inventory service. And we're back. Complete the installation here. You'll notice here we want to wait a few minutes for all the services to load before accessing the web client for the first time. Thankfully, we've got another installation to complete here, which is the inventory service. So as I said, the inventory service is kind of your proxy or your buffer between your users that are attempting to make changes into your environment and the vCenter server that is responsible for actually making those changes. If you think about it, your vCenter server has a couple of different activities that it's required to do. It's required to listen to you and what your needs are, but it also needs to go through and manage what the needs of those hosts are. So this inventory service allows us to offload some aspect of your needs. And the idea here is just to make your management experience with whatever client you're using a little bit easier, a little bit better. You've probably experienced it before when the management tool just doesn't work very well. Sometimes we don't do very good management for our solutions. And so this should hopefully speed up some of those processes. We're going to install this into its default location here with our fully qualified domain name for the server, vc.company.pri. Standard, well, the default ports here, 10.443, 109, and 111. And then here is where we determine the heap size memory, the JVM memory that we need for the inventory service itself. Now, it's important for you when you're making this decision to kind of have an understanding about what size your environment will ultimately be. We're going to set up this JVM memory size so that it matches the number of hosts and or the number of virtual machines that we anticipate seeing in the environment. So less than 100 hosts, 1,000 VMs, between 100 and 400 or more than 400. So this will set how much memory we're setting aside for the JVM. Ours is a small environment in this case, so I can choose small. Once again, got to plunge in that administrator password and username in there, and here is again that lookup service URL. If I've punched in that password correctly, then we should get, once again, the SHA-1 fingerprint of the SSO leaf certificate. That one is, again, what we're looking for, that same self-signed certificate there. And then with this, we can go about installing the inventory service. I'll click the install button here to start that process off. And just like before, let me pause things so that when we come back, we can complete this process with installing the vCenter server. And we're back. Funny little aside, my wife sometimes helps me out with these recordings, and it tickles her every time I get to use the term "and we're back." I don't know why, but she just loves hearing that. And we're back. Well, we are back. Here we are completing the inventory service. Let me hit the finish button here and move ourselves now to the real meat and potatoes of the environment, which is the vCenter server itself. So I've said it a couple of times. All these bits are just prerequisites. And they're there so that we can split up these components to offload these requirements or offload the resource needs from the vCenter server itself. Once we get them on, then we can go through the installation of vCenter Server. And we're accomplishing that here with this step. It is vCenter Server that is going to connect up with the database that we just created using the ODBC configuration that we just put together as well. So here is where kind of the large amount of work is going to be required in order to get our vCenter environment up and running. If you have your license key available, you can punch the license key here into this location. If you don't have it available or you don't want to share it with the rest of the world via a recording through CBT Nuggets, then you can just click the next button and vCenter Server will be installed in evaluation mode. So just make sure you have that license key available so you can punch it in there. You have another decision to make as well. And I kind of showed you how the process works within SQL Server because it's just the server that I have available. vCenter Server can also connect up to an Oracle database as well with various versions that are associated with it in the smallest of environments. So generally about 5 hosts or less. It is also possible for you to use a SQL Server Express instance. Now, in an environment where you've got just up to 5 hosts or up to 50 virtual machines, as it says here, this can be an inexpensive way for you to have a database for this environment. But if you've got the SQL Server license, you'll find that it actually tends to work better with some of these other tools that we'll be adding on a little bit later. These will be things like the update manager. These will be things like all the other stuff that we'll be adding throughout this series. So I'm going to use this traditional SQL database because again, if you're in a production environment, you're probably not going to want to use Express. It's just all the other stuff will fit better and it's easier to manage when I have a full version of SQL. Here is my ODBC connection, right? That VCDB connection we created earlier. With that, we're going to use the credentials of this user, so myself, to go about creating the database, to depositing all the schema, verifying that the schema is there, and all the work that's required over on the database side. Choose Next here. And you'll see we get a little alert here that reminds us that we need to just be conscious of the fact of how we've set up the recovery model. When you initially create that database, the couple of clicks that we went through to create that database, you can see here it sets it up with the full recovery model. You can set that back to simple if you want, but make sure that you're doing transaction log backups. With that in place, I can then go about authenticating you to the vCenter Server service. Now you'll notice here that I'm actually using my own name. So G Shields is the account name, and let me punch in my password here. This may be something that you want to change to perhaps a service account a little later on. In doing so, in creating this, we're actually going to grant myself log on as a service right to the account, this current account, my username. So just be aware that this sets it up to your current user account. Maybe you want to set it up as that service account as part of the installation. That's completely up to you. Now, one thing that your vCenter server has the ability to do is to work independently or also to work with other vCenter servers in what's called linked mode. And while we won't talk much about linked mode here in this series, you should at least be aware that there is the ability to essentially link a vCenter server instance with another or many other instances. Generally, we do this when the size of a single instance goes beyond the maximum size that vCenter Server can handle. In some cases, we also do this when we have different, perhaps geographic locations or different IT teams that maybe you don't want to give them access onto the same server, but you want one server to drive some of the configurations on another. When those are the case, we will create multiple servers and connect them together with linked mode. The idea here is that we're doing it to share information. Now, in our case, we're just doing a single standalone instance. We're going to keep the size small. We don't have multiple teams that we need to worry about. And so we'll just select this first checkbox up here to create a standalone vCenter server instance. I told you before also, be very careful about installing IIS because the vCenter server HTTP and HTTPS ports are 80 and 443, and those are served not by IIS but by Tomcat. If we intend on having more than 2,000 virtual machines simultaneously on a host, well, I may need to increase the number of available ephemeral ports, those that are above 1024. In this case, I don't plan on having more than 2,000 VMs simultaneously on a host. However, if you do in your environment, give me a call because that would just be awesome. I'll choose next here. And then, just as before, I can choose what the JVM memory will be. It will be small, medium, or large. Small, in our case, the username and password so that I can log on to SSO. There again is our SHA-1 fingerprint for the lookup service. And then here we can register what we want our SSO administrator to be. I'll just keep it with administrator at vsphere.local for no other reason than to just pound that username into your brain. I'll choose next again and identify what the lookup service URL is as well as the inventory service URL. Really, as before, these are not as important as what your actual URL is to connect up to manage the interface. So you won't be changing these unless you've changed ports in some of the previous installations, like the inventory service port. Choose next again. Install vCenter Server into its default location, and then complete the installation. So, okay, a lot of stuff here, admittedly, but I don't know. Personally, I find it nice to have all of these individual pages in one nice nugget so that you can see all the steps that are required and prepare yourself for it when it comes time to do it in production. When we come back, I will have all the stuff installed, and then we'll take a look at first the vCenter, the vSphere client, the web client, and how that actually looks. If you've experienced vSphere before, you may not have experienced it through this client, and the client is a little bit different. It's also a little bit quirky as well. So we'll spend some time familiarizing ourselves with the client and just see about how we go about managing our vCenter environment. And we're back. And so we've completed the installation of the vCenter server here. And in fact, I snuck in when you weren't looking and installed the vSphere client as well, the .NET client. It's only 3 clicks, next, finish, to get through to the end of it. So there's not much to see there. So we now have all the bits in place so that we can begin to manage our vSphere environment. One of the things that we'll need to do then is sort of poke around and take a look at what these two new client environments look like. Now, the first is the traditional vSphere client. That's the old way of doing things. And the second is the web client, or the new way of doing things. The URL that you'll use to connect up to that web client will be HTTPS, your server name, bc.company.pri. You'll use port 9443 and /vSphere client. Now, if that seems like a lot of effort, don't worry, because once we get through to this next page here, there actually is a little download you can do, the client integration plugin, which I think it gives you a little start menu icon to make things a little simpler. You'll notice also that we don't trust the certificate here just yet because we're still using a self-signed certificate. So you're going to get a little kind of oops error message here just to remind you that you are using that self-signed cert. Let me go ahead and begin by connecting up through company/gshields and my password. If I click the login button here, this will actually connect us up into our vSphere web client. And as you'll notice, when I click here under vCenter, I can take a look at, wait a minute, I don't actually have any vCenter servers in here. Have I done something wrong? Well, yes and no. The first of which is sort of presuming that vSphere automatically respects the domain admins, the traditional domain admins that you're used to working with in Microsoft Windows. It in fact doesn't. VMware and Microsoft. VMware just doesn't tend to like the way Microsoft does things. And so because of that, we can't just necessarily assume that by virtue of being a domain admin that we're going to automatically have access into vSphere. No, that's not the case. We actually have to grant the correct permissions for all of this integration to work. We have the SSO bits installed, but we haven't made use of those SSO bits to grant whichever users and groups in the Windows world those users and groups the abilities to work with vSphere. So let's instead log on using administrator at vsphere.local and then the password that we used for that account, which I believe was this password. And choose the login button. As I told you, that's sort of the master godlike password for everything here. And it's the one you absolutely have to remember because it is here where we can actually get that vCenter server that we installed, vc.company.pri. Now, there's kind of two things that we want to do here at this point. The first is under administration. Now, under administration, you'll see our single sign-on piece here. And under configuration, you'll note that we have vSphere.local, which is that the vSphere domain that we're working with, or identity source we're working with, the local OS, which is the server name, and then company.pri, which we instructed SSO to connect up automatically. I can add additional identity sources if I want here, whether they be Open LDAP. Check it out, the default is not even Active Directory here. Come on, VMware. Open LDAP, local OS, or Active Directory with integrated Windows authentication. Now, we already have that, so we don't need to add the domain name in here. What we do have to do is give the domain admin, or whichever group you want. So maybe it's your vSphere administrators group, but in my case, I'm going to use domain admins. We do want to give the appropriate group the necessary permissions to modify SSO, as well as the necessary permissions to modify our vCenter server infrastructure. The first step is done here. So users and groups. We are looking at the administrators group, and then under group members, right now it's only the administrator user, administrator at vSphere.local. I need to add into this under company.pri the necessary group that I want to add. So domain admins is the one I'm looking for. Check names, this is correct, okay. That will give me the ability to manipulate the SSO configuration. But here's something that'll actually kind of confuse you. After making that change, for adding domain admins in there, if I try to go to, for example, the vSphere client or log on to the web client using my Windows session credentials, I'm going to end up with an error message that says, wait a minute, you don't have the permissions to connect up to the server vc.company.pri. This can be fairly confusing for you your first time around, because what you actually have to do is come back here under Home, go to vCenter, go to your vCenter server, and here under the vCenter server, the Manage tab and the Permissions tab, add in the Active Directory user or group that you want to give permissions to. So here under Users and Groups, for Company, let me go ahead and make this change here to add in domain admins right up here, checking once again the name, to the proper location here, and to give it the assigned role of administrator. We'll talk more about privileges and how you can set up roles and rights and privileges and things like that in an upcoming nugget. But you gotta at least get through this step before you're ever going to be able to connect up using either the web client or the traditional client. Now, with that in place, I can go back here and log on to my vSphere client. I'm going to click through that little error message here again because I don't have the trusted certificates in place. And once that's done, you'll see now I have access into my vc.company.pri. And I can do the same thing over here if I log out as administrator at vsphere.local. Just be aware of that. That's something that might not be completely evident. I think I'd mentioned before that the client here is just a little quirky in this edition, and that's one of the quirky steps that you have to lay into place if you plan on, well, doing much of anything here inside of the interface. So I want to show you just a couple of things here while we're taking a look at stuff. I already showed you what the SSO looks like and the important bits there with SSO. Here is kind of your starting page for the vSphere web client. It is here where you can make changes to the administration of all the different bits. You can make changes to vCenter, update your rules and profiles, even do some work with vCenter Orchestrator, which we won't talk about for a very long period of time. I need to show you just a couple of pieces here, the first of which is licensing and the second of which is the client plugins. Down here under the licensing node is the location where you'll actually add in additional licenses. Here under license keys is where I can click the add button to punch in what the license key, the value of that license key will be. And then if I want, I can then go ahead and assign that license key to one or more servers. And then also assign it to hosts and clusters and so on. So this is where you're going to actually accomplish that here within the licensing node. Obviously, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to show you what my license keys are, but you can kind of figure it out from that point. Under solutions is where I told you that third-party extensibility comes in. So when a third party wants to write something that hooks into the vSphere web client or also the regular client, this is where you'll actually find those items existing. Here under client plugins, we'll see the 3 items that are existing client plugins. Now these are the ones that exist because we've installed them. You have to go through a 2-phase process to get the plugins to actually work. The first is the install part, and the second is the enabling part. Here you'll notice that all 3 are enabled by default, but I could disable them by right-clicking. A little bit later on, when we start installing some of the other add-on pieces, like the Update Manager, for example, it is in this location or in the traditional client location, I'll show you here in just a second, where we go about installing the plugin and then enabling the plugin, or disabling it if we don't want it. So it is here that the client plugins exist inside of the web client. Here under the vSphere client, and I'm just going to show you this so that for completeness, there is also the ability to take a look at plugins as well here under the Plugins and Manage Plugins tab. So once they're installed, we'll see them here as available plugins, and we can then enable them and bring them into our client. So important to recognize, because as I said, both of these clients are just a bit quirky in the way that they go about accomplishing the tasks that they need to accomplish. So we have one final task here, at least for this nugget, and that's to talk just a bit about some of the high availability things. And I only want to touch on these at the highest level, okay, just to kind of make you aware that when we're talking about all these 4 components that, well, some environments, we need to have the ability to manage our environment no matter what might happen. And so if our vCenter server goes down, well, I need to make sure that I have some sort of failover potential for that contingency to occur, for that situation to occur. I want to kind of go through the steps, so that the possible options that are available by looking here at this custom install screen, because it gives us a really good view of the components that exist in vCenter once they've been installed. If I add in one final bit, and that's the database over here, that database references or stores all the content that vCenter server actually works with. If you intend on making your environment highly available, I would be very cautious or very conscious of these 4 different elements and where you can make them highly available. We talked earlier about how to make an additional SSO server available by just simply installing the SSO piece onto a different machine and then turning on replication. That's part of one of the checkboxes that we went through when we were installing SSO. The web server here can be put behind some sort of load balancer so that we can support load balancing across multiple web clients, whether that be NLB or something maybe a little bit more intelligent. The inventory service here does not actually have any built-in HA capability whatsoever. But VMware's sort of recommendation with the inventory service is perhaps to set it up as an HA-enabled virtual machine. So we'll talk about HA in an upcoming nugget, but to set it up as a virtual machine inside a vSphere cluster and turn on HA so that if the inventory service dies, well, it'll get restarted on another machine. The vCenter server here can be set up also as a redundant server or as a highly available server, although there are a number of different ways in which you can accomplish that. Remember that the vCenter server is nothing more than a machine that takes a look at the data in the database and responds to requests. And so it is entirely possible that your HA plan for your vCenter server is to just simply rebuild this server and then reattach it to an existing database on some other machine. That's totally possible. You could set it up as an HA-enabled VM. That's another option. You could also incorporate a technology called vCenter Server Heartbeat, which is an add-on feature. Costs more money, but allows you to have instant failover for your vCenter server components. So you have kind of a couple different options here for making this highly available. Again, at the very sort of lowest common denominator, it is a very simple process to just create a new vCenter server and attach it to an offsite database, and it will pick up all the configurations and continue to work. Lastly, don't forget SQL clustering or Oracle clustering. The clustering tools or the log shipping or the mirroring tools or whatever tool you want to set into place to ensure that you have multiple copies of data is another way in which you can ensure that you have high availability to protect yourself against the failure of a single component here. So all of these are things that you really kind of want to worry about when you're thinking about installing your vCenter server infrastructure. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We have talked about the installation and configuration of vCenter server, both from the very high level perspective in terms of additions and requirements and HA requirements as we start to go through our design activities, all the way down into some of the low level things like installing vCenter server, setting up some of the licensing, installing and configuring the vSphere client and the web client, taking a look at those client plugins, and then also dealing with the SSO identity sources and all that very important task of setting up those initial Active Directory focused permissions. Coming up next, we're going to begin populating our vCenter server with ESXi hosts. And we're also going to see how an ESXi host gets installed using some of the manual methods. There are in fact a variety of ways in which you can install ESXi. And we'll talk about some of the very basic ones and perhaps some of the ones you'll probably use most often, at least in this beginning part of your exploration into vSphere. That's the topic for our next nugget, so until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.